Hey guys, this is Mark. In this video, I will discuss the process of rendering images that come from the Backendless file storage by using Backendless Files API to retrieve information from the file storage. The scenario is fairly simple. I want to retrieve directory listing, get the listing of all the URLs for the images in my file storage, and then render those images in some sort of image gallery fashion. The data that I'm working with, you can see here in the files. If we go to the backend and then the files section, I do have a directory called pictures with subdirectories such as food with various pictures. Likewise, there is a directory nature and people. This will be a fairly iterative process because I also want to demonstrate visually the rendering abilities of the container component and block components, just so you can see the differences between these components and how they react in terms of rendering dynamic data. To get started, let's create our first page. There will be several. Let's call this one Gallery 1. And let's put a container component right into the page. This container, we can give it a name. For instance, we can call it Gallery Container. There is one cell, and we can transfer and drag the image component right into the cell. The API that we will use will go right into the page logic. So select the page and go to the logic, and in the on page enter, click add logic. Take a look at the file API under Backendless. In here, you will see that there is a block called get directory listing. Get directory listing, you can put the name of the directory. In my case, it is pictures. And the pattern, we can select that we want all JPEG images, and notice that it has include subdirectory. So it will recursively go throughout the entire directory structure and return a list of all the files located in that path. Every single element in the returned list is going to be an object that describes that file, and it will contain various properties such as name, public URL, the timestamp when it was created, and a few others. So in here, now that we have this get directory listing and we have the collection of these images, we need to assign it to something, and we need to assign it to our container. And notice that here we do not have the category to manage the dynamic containers. And this is for the reason that if we go back to user interface, select gallery container, we did not select dynamic list behavior, but really should have. So selecting dynamic list behavior and then returning to the logic for the page, notice that now we have this dynamic list section. In here, drag this set dynamic list items to, and then assign whatever this block returns as the items of this gallery container. The container component works in a way where all rows will be replicated for every single item, which already sounds like it's not something that we want, but I will still want to demonstrate what this will look like anyway. So now if we select the image, and let's select the data binding for the image. In the source URL, it's going to be public URL. And then the reason we select public URL is not a coincidence, because this is a property of the file object returned from the directory listing. So every single object, as I said, has properties, and public URL is one of those properties. So now if we run this page, you will see that the images are being rendered in a single column, and this is for the reason that the container replicates the row with all the contents in that row for every single object that is returned from the server, and every single object is going to be a single file. So we are getting the effect of images being rendered. However, they're not being rendered exactly as one would expect, where the images go in rows without being split into a row for every single image. Can something be done about this? Sure. Well, the container component would probably not be a good idea if you want to have a single cell containing an image. You could have multiple cells. That would make it more complicated. Or a much simpler solution would be to use a block. So let me show exactly the same behavior with a block. So now we have a block. Let's call it gallery block. it needs to be selected as with a dynamic list behavior. And just like with the container, we will drag an image into this block. So this image would need to have the same data binding, public URL. And now in the page, on page enter, rather than setting dynamic list items to gallery container, we're going to set it to gallery block. And let's run this page again. So as you can see, it renders them exactly the same. And this is for the reason that by default, the block has the direction top to bottom. So if we change the direction, and that's really the only change we're going to do. Let's see what will happen now. So now the images are being rendered, but they're being rendered all in one single row. So there's absolutely no wrapping. How do we get wrapping? Well, this will be the property of the flex wrap right here. So the block is selected, and in flex wrap, if we select wrap, then the images will start wrapping as soon as they get to the end of the available real estate in the screen. Let's take a look. So as you can see, images hit this edge right here and then being rolled over to the next line, which is already better, but still there are different things that we could do to make it even better. To make it even better, I will create a new page and call it Gallery 2. And in here, we will still use the container. And now every single row will be responsible for rendering images for a particular directory. Remember that on the server side, the structure was that we had the directory called pictures, and then there are subdirectories. So what we will do is we will use a row in the container to render images from a subdirectory, because every directory is sort of a group. So we have a group of pictures of food, pictures of nature, and people. So a single row in Gallery 2 will be responsible for rendering pictures from a subdirectory. Let's drag a container and then set the dynamic list behavior. We will call it the same name, Gallery Container. Let's also add a row, and in this cell, let's put a text component. This text will render the name of that directory, so we will know what that grouping is. It will be either food, nature, or people. We will change the height because this is a little bit too big out of the box. We do not need these 100 pixels. And then the row height could also be eliminated. The text itself, let's make it a little bit larger. For instance, 32 pixels. The data binding for the text will be name, because when an item is returned from the directory listing, the name property contains the actual name of directory or file. And in here, in this cell, we will place a block. And you will see why I did it this way. And then inside of this block, there will be an image. Just like that. Select the cell and set the width to, let's say, 1/12 to be the smallest. And it is okay that it overlaps right now like this. So now in our block, we can set the size of, for instance, 100 pixels by 100 pixels. And just to make it a little bit, give it some sort of decoration. And by the way, inside of this block, one other thing that I'd like you to do is remove the padding. And go into decorations. And let's set the radius of 20 pixels on every corner. Select the image now, and let's also set the image of 100 pixels by 100 pixels. And then this image is inside of this block, and also on this block, find the overflow and make it hidden. Additionally, what I'd like you to do is select the block, and we need to configure some padding. So padding on the right could be 10 pixels, and padding on the bottom could also be 10 pixels. And you will see why I did it this way. Select the image and go into data binding, and it's going to be still public URL. All right, so now let's add some logic that will retrieve the information from the server. The way this will work, at first what I will retrieve only the directories of the pictures. So I will get the actual names of our directories, which will become the names of the categories. And then for every single directory, I will configure additional data binding where I retrieve files for that specific directory. So let's start working on that. Let's go into page, and in the on-page enter logic, what we want to do is set dynamic list items to gallery container, and in file API go to get directory listing. We want to get listing of the directory pictures, and then without the subdirectory. So this will return only those 3 folders that we have. And at this point, if we render it, we will get 3 rows because this already has data binding. Let's take a look. As you can see, there are 3 sections, and of course ignore the image because it's being rendered from something that doesn't exist. There is no image for the item that represents a directory, but at least we are getting the behavior that is intended. So the next step will be to actually grab the images from an item that represents the directory. By the way, I think it would be helpful to actually take a look at what comes over the wire from the API calls. If we go into inspect and select network and reload this page, we will see the API call that grabs those directories. So this is the API call, and in the preview you see that these are the items that we get. So the name property is what the text field is being bound to, and the public URL represents the actual URL of the directory. So what we will need to do is we will need to grab the images from the URL, but the way the API works is the block in Codeless will actually use the URL property, not the public URL, because the URL is relative, it's shorter, and it will be understood by Backendless. So as I said, the next step will be is to create a logic that will retrieve the contents of this URL property from the server side, where all the images will be coming from. Let's work on that right now. So for this, what we will need to do is select the row, and the row will have its own dynamic list behavior, which means that if we go into the logic for the row, and then in the dynamic list items logic, what we will need to do is to add logic that will fetch all the files from the directory that is represented by this data model. Go into file API and once again get directory listing, and then the path will be the property URL from this object. URL, we will be fetching all JPEG files. There is no reason to recurse, and that should just do it. So set the minimum width for the cell like this, and let's see what this looks like now. So now, as you can see, we fetched the files for each of the directories, and now we're rendering them in a gallery style, which is sort of the effect that I wanted to achieve. But as you can see, the approach is somewhat different because we got the directories first, and then the row itself used the logic to fetch the files from that specific directory. Now this is going to be it. We reviewed 2 different approaches, and you saw how components work differently. And then with this gallery 2, it was a combination of doing one fetch to get the listing of directories for the container itself, and then second fetch, well, for each row we do an additional fetch of the files for that specific directory. However, the focus of course was on the image component, and as you can see, working with the image in this case was exactly the same regardless of the approach. We provide the data binding property where the image is coming from, and the images are being rendered exactly as we wanted them to do. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you found this useful, and as always, happy codeless coding.